I rise to make a short statement about one component of this bill, and that is the requirement to essentially repeal the hard-won reforms of the previous parliament around poker machines. This bill seeks to repeal what were very, very modest reforms that were introduced by the previous government, reluctantly with the support of the Greens. The previous parliament had a wonderful opportunity to take action on the issue of problem gambling. It was an issue that came to national prominence on the basis of the fact that we had a minority government with several crossbenchers who recognised that this was one of the great unmet challenges of government, that successive state governments had failed in their duty to protect ordinary people who were losing billions of dollars on poker machines, and who also recognised that Australia had a very unique a problem around poker machines, because our machines were the equivalent of the most aggressive and rapacious machines anywhere in the world. If these were guns, they would be the semi-automatic weapons of the gun world. So some very modest reforms were proposed initially. They were, well, firstly there was a proposal for $1 bet limits, which was a Productivity Commission-backed proposal. The Prime Minister agreed to a scheme of mandatory pre-commitment, and most disappointingly those reforms fell apart when there was a change to the composition of the parliament and the elevation of Peter Slipper to a Speaker. That is the history of that reform. Ultimately, the previous government suggested a scheme of voluntary pre-commitment, but at least ensuring that every machine that was replaced, that every new machine would have mandatory pre-commitment technology and the opportunity to network those machines. The Greens reluctantly supported it because we knew that we weren't going to achieve a reform other than the one that was proposed by the then government. We supported it because it was a small step forward, but we were disappointed that the level of ambition in terms of attempting to address the issue of problem gambling was so limited. What we saw was ultimately a proposal that passed the parliament that would, at least for the very first time, put the federal government in the poker machine space. Up until that time, this had been the domain of state governments, and for the first time, as far as my own personal commitment to this issue is concerned, for the first time I was pleased that we finally got a federal government to recognise that what we've got here is a regressive tax, targeting predominantly people on low incomes, and the federal government was finally prepared to act. Not in a way that we would have liked, but at least they were taking a step into this issue that future parliaments could build on. One of the great, I'd say, disappointments of my short time in this parliament is that what we saw was the government, who'd always opposed reform in this area because this new government is hand in glove with the gambling industry. It was remarkable that we saw the now minister introduce the now government's policy in the lead up to the election on the Clubs Australia website. I mean, absolutely remarkable that we would have a minister who is charged with gambling policy who believes that that means that rather than balancing the needs of industry and protecting ordinary members of the community who become addicted to poker machines, that he confuses that role with one of essentially an industry shill, someone out there campaigning for the pokies industry. And to see the now Minister in this area announce the Coalition's policy on the Clubs Australia website was, I think, a reflection of where this government's priorities lie. But what was even more disappointing is that despite all of the pain, all of the anguish that this issue brought the Labor Party in the last term of government, that the Labor Party have effectively backed the government's repeal of the very modest poker machine reforms. That, for me, in my short time in this place, was a huge shock, a huge disappointment, and probably the greatest disappointment in the area of gambling policy, because I just find it remarkable that an issue that could bring so much pain and political discomfort to the previous government, who finally mustered the courage to introduce such modest reforms, would now back away from those reforms. I don't understand it. Well, no, I do understand it. I understand it because it represents everything that is wrong with politics in Australia, and that is that we have vested interests who patrol the corridors of Parliament, who are walking in and out of offices every day. If they're not walking in and out of offices as lobbyists, they're employed as parliamentary staffers, doing the bidding of big business and ensuring that members of Parliament are subjected to concerted lobbying and pressure, and what we see is politicians who don't have the guts to stand up to them. And that's why we're here today, because Clubs Australia have mounted a successful campaign, and we're seeing both sides of politics essentially standing up for the interests of a big business, of an industry that strips billions of dollars from people on low incomes, and no one on either side with the political courage to stand up and say, well, we're going to take a stand here, we're going to stand up to this industry, we're going to stand by these very modest reforms that were introduced, and here we are. Here we are. The federal government now backtracking on poker machine reforms. It is a great disappointment. It does reflect everything that's wrong in Australian politics, the power of big business, the power of vested interests, the undue influence, not just on this issue. We've seen it time and time again. We saw it during the mining debate through the mining tax. We've seen it in a range of areas, and now we're seeing it here when it comes to poker machines. It is a great disappointment, and the Greens absolutely oppose that section of the bill that seeks to remove protections for ordinary people on poker machines. Quite simply, this is an issue that could be addressed in this way. Put $1 bet limits on machines, allow ordinary punters to have a punt on the pokies, reduce the amount of money that people will lose from several thousands of dollars in an hour to a few $100s, and in that way ensure that young kids don't go hungry at night, that people don't lose their homes, and that marriages don't break up. But unfortunately, we've taken a step back from that today, and it is to the shame of both sides of politics.